Let me demonstrate a different way of drawing, a different process, a different way of thinking and progressing our drawing than the one you're probably using, but possibly, at least to use at times, depending on the subject, a more accurate way of establishing the main shapes that we want. Here we have a small Australian native plant that's growing in the ashes of a fire reduction burn that happened during winter. And so these shapes are all very irregular. Even if we were looking straight on at each of these shapes, they're not all identical, although they're similar. But because of the nature of the plant growth, they're all twisted at different angles to us, whether we're looking at the petals on these lovely light mauve flowers or the leaves. Now, what I want you to do is watch the way I plot each of these petals and each of the leaves. It's probably going to be easier to see with the leaves, but first, notice with the petals, which I draw first, that I don't just do a simple outline around the shape of the petal. What I do is I do a series of positioning marks, often just a dot. It might be an actual little curve, but each petal I create in 2 or 3 or 4 marks. I don't just run around the outline, because running around the outline creates a couple of problems. One is we get a fairly heavy, definitely continuous line, and that creates a very heavy shape, which just is not a suitable effect for a light, delicate flower such as this. But the second thing is, it's very hard to control the shape when we're moving the pen at the same time, to work out exactly how far do I go before I take the corner, and exactly how sharply or widely do I take the corner, if you like. Whereas if I'm drawing each petal, or each leaf for that matter, in sections, using a number of lines or marks, I can put at the start some of the marks and lines which will actually create the furthest extent of this particular petal or leaf that we can see. And then I can link it back with the starting point, which most of the time I've already established. And this way, the leaf goes to the place, or the petal goes to the extreme in this scene where I want it to go, so it's as long or as high, whatever, in the overall drawing as I want. But it also goes back to the original starting place. And so, in a sense, everything lines up nicely. And with a relatively simple plant such as this, it's important that we get a sense that every leaf and every petal can go back to its place of origin in relation to every other leaf and petal if we're going to have a sense of reality. We don't have to be able to actually trace it back, we don't have to see the stems, but we have a sense that the direction of the growth is such that it all flows back, a bit like a river flowing in the opposite direction, that all the branches smoothly line up into each other. Another thing we can do when we're doing even an individual petal in a number of different lines is we can much more easily vary the thickness of the line. And so perhaps where a line represents an edge that's curving out of sight, so we actually don't see the edge of the petal from this angle, we can do a very light line, which I think creates that sense of we're not seeing the edge, the object's actually disappearing from view. But versus perhaps the other side of the petal, where we do see the actual edge. And that creates visually a slightly stronger effect of reality. Even in a very thin petal such as these, we can actually see the depth, the thickness as well. And so in a few places, not in the petals, but in the leaves, I actually do a second line very close to the first that just in parts I try and give a sense of depth to these leaves so that they do have a sense of 2 dimensions. It's tricky on this scale because if they're too far apart, then it may not read as a depth line. If they're too close together, they'll converge into one really heavy ink line, which I don't want either. So It's a it's a bit of a fine line, and I don't want to do it to all of them because then it will just look like some sort of visual echo everywhere. So I really just want to do that in a few places for a few leaves where we see the edge of the leaf more side on than for other leaves tilted at other angles. Notice too, I drew the flowers before I drew the stems. It's a bit like the way I draw the foliage of a canopy on a tree before I draw the trunks. I find it's easier to make sure that things line up that way in the right place in relation to each other, that the position is correct. Now, with the leaves, you'll notice that most of the time I actually start by doing that center line. And before I do the center line, I often put a dot to establish exactly where that center line's going to end. And I line that up now with what I've already drawn because I have enough with the flowers drawn to reference to help my accuracy. One of the issues is keeping everything in scale, and it's easy when we're just concentrating on the on the detail of drawing a small part, that we forget to look at the overall size, the overall scale of our drawing, and we suddenly go too large or too small with an individual leaf because we've focused just on that leaf and we've forgotten to look at our overall scene. And I find that particularly happens with foliage such as this large foliage, and it particularly happens with pot plants between the left and the right side of the pot. It's really easy to draw the foliage on one side slightly larger or smaller in scale to the other side. And sometimes that can look a bit odd. Now at this stage, I'm actually thinking this is just going to be a simple line drawing. You're watching this at 1 3/4 time my drawing speed. So if you took it back to half time, it would be slightly slower than my actual time. But I wanted this to be a fairly delicate drawing. But at the end when I finished it, it looked a bit blank, it looked a bit bare. And so I thought, look, I'll put some of the value behind it to create the dark value that we have in the reference from the ash, as well as the shadow of the plant, but particularly the local colour of the ash that was created with the burn off that happened there. And so there's a number of these all over the place. So these have obviously germinated quickly and they've come to flat. Their life cycle is fairly short, just a small amount of foliage, and they're producing flowers, and they'll seed, and those seeds will probably stay dormant in the soil until there's another either bushfire or deliberate burn. We have a whole host of seeds that germinate very quickly after a fire, and that stabilizes the soil. And then by the time these first arrivals are dying, there are other slightly more substantial plants that have germinated and are starting to grow, and they will hold the soil. But even so, they might only have a lifespan of a few years or 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then another stage of plants that might have a 10 or 15 year lifespan take their place. But in the meantime, there's some trees starting to grow, or at least some trees start to reshoot at ground level as well. So it's a wonderful procession to watch the regeneration close up and at frequent intervals of the Australian bush, because fires, of course, have been an important part of it. Now, we're switching to 4 times normal speed now while I'm doing the value. I'm really just trying to suggest the burnt embers and charcoal of sticks and little stones and things, because I'm really just wanting to throw part of this in relief. The problem is I started this not having planned to do it, and therefore I didn't have a coherent sense of what I was trying to do. So I reminded myself of the importance of the planning I usually do before I start to draw anything, because I kind of went too dark, too high. If I were doing this again, what I'm doing now, I probably wouldn't do it all, and what's slightly below this, I would have done a bit lighter. So I would have established the real darkness across the center, lower of perhaps the foliage lower down. And I would have left the flowers just perhaps standing proud, standing apart from the darker value. Or, equally, I might have been better off doing the dark value over all of this. So it is interesting. I've sort of proved to myself that it really is always worth a few minutes just strategizing how we want what we're drawing to look. And of course, I had done that at the start, but I then changed it dramatically and hadn't really thought out that second part. But having said that, it's a beautiful little subject, and I'm really happy enough with the look at the end. Please hit the like button for me if you haven't already. That's very helpful for me. And of course, you'll find this photo on my channel community page if you want to have a go drawing it yourself, which I'd recommend. So really going through the motions now of creating the effect of this leaf litter and these burnt things. But I think you'll be able to see at the end, if I hadn't taken it as dark as high, it just would have had a nicer balance. But equally, we are looking down on this, not directly, but we're certainly not looking at it side on. We're looking more down than straight side on. And so we are seeing the ground behind it as well. Hope you give this a go. And look, I hope you give plotting the petals and the leaves a chance doing it this way, and just see whether it helps you establish more accurate petals and leaves than perhaps what you might get if you normally would just draw around the outside. And I really think even having slight gaps between the marks that create the leaves and the petals just helps give a sense of reality, because when we look at something, we don't see the entire outline all at once the same way. We end up having to focus on parts, and so there are tiny gaps or differences at the very least in our vision of the different elements. So it's all about trying to create an effect that echoes reality if we want to inject a sense of realism into our subjects. It's not realism for how the subject is, but it's the realism of how things look like when we see them. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. Please let me know in the comments if you draw it, whether you found this approach, firstly, a new approach in how you process the actual drawing process, and if you found it helpful to create a stronger sense of accuracy of detail and scale. But look, in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, and certainly however it turns out, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.